Un journaliste en prison en Europe. Ce n'est pas un film, mais l'histoire de Julian Assange. Son crime, avoir révélé via son média WikiLeaks des crimes commis par les armées américaines et européennes en Irak et Afghanistan. Il subit depuis une véritable chasse à l'homme. Mais ça, c'est sans compter sur sa femme, Stella Assange, qui se bat depuis des années pour sa liberté. Aujourd'hui, j'ai la chance de la rencontrer. Welcome, Stella, to Brussels, and thank you very much for this interview.
Thank you.
And we, of course, are going to talk a little bit about the reasons why Julian is in prison. But first, about you, maybe. You grew up in South Africa, and I heard that you heard about and you witnessed maybe the violence of the apartheid regime and the crimes of the apartheid regime, but did it had an influence to your decision to study law and to become a human rights lawyer?
Yes, for sure. I mean, the South African apartheid regime was everything that was occurring within its borders was legislated, and this was an extremely brutal, authoritarian country towards the large majority of its population. It made me realize early on that the nature of power, of unbridled power, and that really the human rights safeguards, they're the only thing that really protect us in the end, because power at its core is raw, it's brutal, and it will seek to assert itself whenever it can, so you need to constrain it. And the law is one way, and one of the last ways of doing that. So for sure, I saw that as one of the tools one of the only tools that one has as someone who wants to fight for justice and a fair society, to reach that.
And it's also because of that drive that you joined the Julian Assange legal team to get him free.
Yes, in 2011, I joined his legal team, and I immediately, so I had been following the WikiLeaks disclosures for some time, but really, it was really on my radar in 2010. Like for most people who were, I don't know, watching the news or minimally interested in what was going on in the world. And I immediately recognized that this was a person who was doing something extraordinary, that it was a game changer, and that people in power were very obsessed with what kind of impact this would have on them, because it was actually making journalism truly effective as a democratic tool.
He created WikiLeaks and to cover up, to expose this state-sponsored crimes, etc. If you look at with the eyes of today, it's the Iraq, the revelations on the Iraq and the Afghan war. They started really the fuss about WikiLeaks, and why was it so important, these revelations, especially on the Iraq and the Afghan war?
Well, so the Iraq and Afghan publications, they were leaked by Chelsea Manning, and WikiLeaks published them in 2010, and they were the most comprehensive insight into a war or into wars that had ever been accessible. So it was the Pentagon's own raw data of how many kills, where, how many people had been maimed, and so on.
They kept all that information themselves.
They kept it themselves, and then publicly they would deny it. So, look, the Afghan and Iraq wars were highly sanitized in the media. The way the reporters were allowed to report it was, through press conferences and by the Pentagon and so on, who controlled the information, and through embedded journalists and so on. And so the media had a dependency on the Pentagon, who hoarded the information. Of course, for Iraqis and Afghans, And the military, who was actually, the people who were actually fighting the war for the, the U.S. and so on, and European countries, they saw what it was like on the ground. But in terms of the media, they were receiving and reporting a very sanitized version. And this is a war, of course, in the case of Iraq, that was an illegal war that, we were lied into, that the immense majority of the population in Europe and in the US, I think, opposed. And yet it proceeded. And it revealed things like that the US had a record of 15,000 individual civilian casualties that they hadn't disclosed. And of course, they wouldn't disclose it, right? Because that might affect the viability of continuing the war, or of sending, soldiers to fight this war, or receiving the budget and so on. So it's purely political reasons why the Pentagon wouldn't disclose this. But imagine for these victims to not even be acknowledged, and that information, it belongs to the victims and their families, and it also belongs to the taxpayers who are paying for this war.
Once Julian said wars are always started with lies, but can be ended with truth. And this war and lie, you see that it goes together, but why?
Because wars are hell, quite literally. They're the opposite of our sense of basic humanity, and the brutality of war is just something that should naturally cause aversion to regular people, and so the interests that want to drive war are very obsessed with controlling the narrative around war. And that's why they say truth is the first casualty of war, because if the true reality of what's happening on the ground is known to the average person who doesn't have, a share in Lockheed Martin or whatever, who doesn't benefit from the bloodshed, the natural thing is for their humanity to say this has to stop. The killing has to stop. The destruction has to stop. It never serves any purpose. That's why it's so true what he says about the truth can start peace, because once the unmanipulated information about complex situations, where it's not about goodies and baddies, it's about, people dying and destruction and terrible things happening, and escalations because of short-term calculations, and you need a way out, and a way out requires for truth to be able to be spoken, because if both sides have complete control over the narrative, then it becomes a locked situation that can spiral out of control. And in the case of Iraq and Afghanistan, it was clear by 2010 that these wars were basically unwinnable by the U.S. And yet they continued because, as Julian said, the goal is not a successful war; it's an endless war. And in order to understand that, you have to understand who benefits from endless wars, and who bears the cost. And the cost is borne primarily by those who have to suffer physically the consequences, but it also involves a transfer from the tax base into...
From budgets, from social project to the war industries.
To the war industry, yeah.
And then if we are talking about the role of journalists, because after all, Julian is a journalist, and so he received information from a source, he possessed this information, and he made it public. Yeah. So that is journalism. And once you said, Julian is being prosecuted as a journalist, not as a whistleblower, not as anything else, but as a journalist.
I think it was for some years, because Julian introduced certain innovations into journalism, such as the use of encryption for communications and for receiving information through the electronic drop box in an untraceable manner, entering into partnerships with other organizations. These two aspects are now standard procedure for all the major newspapers.
So he pioneered that renewal, in fact.
He pioneered these innovations, but at the time it was seen like he was an outsider doing things that weren't. That's not how journalism is done, and so there was a recognition that this was a really these were the biggest scoops in journalistic history, really. But they were done by an outsider who was doing things differently. And there's actually a very interesting paper by a deputy attorney general of the U.S. who argues that the American press has been, it's called the WikiLeaksization of the American press. And he says, well, these were the innovations. Now they all use it. So it was always the case that what Julian was engaged in was journalism. It was effective journalism. It was journalism of the 21st century. But it was journalism. And there was an attempt to falsely try to say that he was different. But then when it comes down to analyzing the activity, even the Obama administration said that they could not find any way to differentiate the activity from what the New York Times does in its essence, that is receiving, possessing, communicating to the public. And so the Obama administration said this administration is not prepared to prosecute Julian Assange for the Chelsea Manning leaks, because the only way to do so, having analyzed the facts, is to effectively to criminalize journalism, and this administration is not prepared to do that. The only thing that changed was that there was a different administration, and they decided that they did want to set the precedent. They did want to describe
But that is rather shocking. But the things you say is that if the possession and the publication of vital information is being criminalized, it's not only about Julian, it's about journalism in its whole.
Absolutely, and that's always been the case, and especially because Julian he's not an American citizen. You know, he came to Europe to publish. He came to Europe because of the safeguards that were here, because of the partnerships that he had here, and what the U.S. has done has basically asserted that it has jurisdiction over the rest of the world and over the rest of the world's journalists, and it can pluck any person who reports about criminal behavior by the U.S. administration and claim to have jurisdiction over them and put them in prison. But it's not just that. I mean, if you look at what's just happened over the past few days, Russia has used its espionage laws to prosecute a Wall Street Journal reporter, and this is the first time that a U.S. reporter is prosecuted under this legislation since the Cold War. It's not like they didn't have the law wasn't there to do it before. It's that they've decided to use that legislation in the same way that the U.S. is using its espionage laws against Julian. This is.
And you think there is a link that Russia now is prosecuting this journalist from the Wall Street Journal with laws that they already had because of there was some kind of precedent internationally with the Trump administration to prosecute Julian?
I think the U.S. is setting a global template about how to go after reporters, journalists, dissidents, whatever. And there had long been a consensus that you just don't go after journalists. Russia could have just expelled the guy Like it expels American citizens all the time, for various reasons. But they've actually decided to do this. And I think as soon as Julian's indictment came down in the U.S., Bolsonaro went against Glenn Greenwald with a very similar accusation to the one that there was against Julian. And then as soon as Julian was arrested as well, in Australia you saw Australian federal police raiding the national broadcaster ABC and changing legislation which included, for example, that the Australian security services have the right to even change the contents of the computers of the national broadcast or of reporters, withdraw information and so on. This is completely mad.
So it's a kind of worldwide principled struggle also. It's about Julian, but it's a principled struggle also to have the freedom for journalists to publish, because what you're saying is that with this action of the United States administration, they're setting a kind of very regressive standard on journalism worldwide, not only
worldwide, and it's a global collapse of standards because, the United States has long used press freedom as one of its kind of political cultural exports, but now, when it sets such a high-profile precedent against a publisher, a journalist who, don't forget that the publications that Julian is indicted over, Iraq, Afghanistan, Guantanamo Bay, the diplomatic cables, they are the publications for which WikiLeaks and Julian have had the highest recognition for these very publications. Julian's been repeatedly nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize precisely because of these publications, and that's what the U.S. is now saying is prosecutable crime. So it's a global collapse of protections for journalists, and it's an attack on the public's right to know, because the effect of this is that journalists everywhere are inhibited. There is a chilling effect from just the fact of having this prosecution. That's why you see, the Washington Post, the New York Times, and the Guardian, and so on. Some of these publications did quite a lot of effort, put quite a lot of effort into trying to really undermine WikiLeaks and Julian for a long time. So it's not like they're interested or want WikiLeaks to continue to exist, but they have come out and they've said this case is an attack on press freedom. It undermines existing protections. It affects our ability to publish. And that's because they are receiving leaks that they're not publishing. Because as soon as it goes to their legal departments, their lawyers are going to say, the Assange precedent means that you just can't risk it.
So it's preemptive censorship that's being applied
absolutely
from fear to be prosecuted by the United States.
Already now there is an inhibition to publish, which means that we as a public are not receiving information because journalists are not going to risk going to prison or spending huge amounts in legal fees when the administration, be it the U.S. administration or other administrations, are prepared to do this. And Julian's case, the purpose of putting Julian in prison indefinitely and in this really arbitrary and cruel way is firstly, of course, to silence him, but probably more of a motivation for them is to create him as a symbol of you can't do this, you're not going to do this, and to bring the press to corral the press and control the press and intimidate them.
When you talk about the prison and the conditions in the prison, I heard that you were married this year with Julian in prison. Most
Last
people
year.
last year. Okay, sorry. Most people marry in freedom. You marry Julian in prison. It must have been quite a special feeling. I do think bittersweet, maybe, to marry someone in prison. Or
It was bittersweet, but for us, getting married was an expression of freedom within, within a prison. But that was our freedom to decide to marry and to actually go through with it. It was quite a long process to get it authorized. There was a lot of stalling by the prison. There was some threatened legal action by us. But eventually they allowed us to get married. They didn't allow the guests we wanted. The two witnesses we wanted were declined because they were journalists.
no journalist allowed.
No journalists allowed. So in the end, it was just 6 people, including our 2 children. So it was Julian's father and his brother, and my mother and my brother, and the 2 kids, and that was it. And there were 2 guards in the room, of course. My wedding dress was designed by Vivienne Westwood, who recently passed away, and she was a great friend of ours and a huge supporter of Julian. And so her gift to us was to make this beautiful dress as a statement. And it was a win for us to be able to actually marry. And when Julian's free, because I do believe we will win this, obviously we're going to have to do a few belated celebrations. Our wedding, Julian's 50th birthday, my 40th birthday, they're all kind of pending celebrations. It's all on hold.
So let's hope they will happen. And because if you see the situation in prison, the injustice Julian faces is a great injustice. And at the same time, you're talking about hope and you're warning against a sense of powerlessness. You're an optimistic lawyer, an optimistic fighter, but your optimism and your drive, where does it come from?
Well, I think it comes from seeing that Julian actually can be freed, that we can actually win this, and I see this as not just my solo fight. It's not my solo fight. It's Julian's entire family is committed to getting him out, and millions of other people, because millions of other people have basically become witnesses to an enormous injustice, because they've come to understand, I think, over time, that you don't need to understand the ins and outs of the legal case, the legislation in the US, legislation in the UK, this and that. You just see the naked facts, and the naked facts are that Julian has been in the harshest prison in the UK for 4 years and counting. He's indefinitely there. He's there because the US wants to extradite him. The US has a sentence of 175 years, and it is accusing him of publishing the most significant information about war and the killing of civilians and torture and crimes against humanity. I mean, it couldn't be more extreme. I think the intrinsics of the case are so important, and that the only thing standing between Julian and his freedom is people's awareness about what's going on, because any person with a sense of justice, fairness, and a love for democracy will be moved to call for his freedom, and wouldn't tolerate what's going on. And yeah, I don't like to use the word hope, because I think hope can be a little bit distancing. I think you really need to get your get down and work towards a goal. And there are different ways of doing that. And some people protest on the street regularly. Some people just talk about Julian's case with their friends and family whenever they can. Some people, there are people all over who are doing their part or what they can to try to bring this awareness. And we have, from, as I said, protesters on the street to heads of state, the president of Mexico, the president of Brazil, the president of Argentina, the prime minister of Australia, even the United Nations, the OSCE. There's a movement, I think, at every level, which understands the importance of this case. It's not just about the self-interest of the press. It's about, whether we are going to be living in a free and open society, or whether this is just the end of it.
And a last question for viewers and listeners to this podcast. So, which is the best way to act to support the campaign of to free Julian Assange?
Well, I'd say stay informed about the case. You can follow me on Instagram, Stella Assange, and Twitter, which is the same, Stella _ Assange. There's a website called don'textraditeassange.com, which has a lot of links to, for example, documentaries and videos and statements by these organizations that I've mentioned, and also an action page. But there are also grassroots initiatives, and obviously people can donate within the European Union. There's the Bouw-Holland Foundation that takes donations, and those are tax deductible. And there are actions happening all the time. So I would say just stay engaged, because something might be happening near you any moment.
Okay, thank you very much, Stella, and please, listeners and viewers, go to the social media of Stella. So thank you for your strength and passing this strength to other people, and we will commit ourselves to continue to support the campaign to free Assange, because in the end it's a campaign for democracy and free journalism for everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.